Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name's Jennifer, and today we are going to be talking about questions to ask on your hospital delivery tour. So most first-time moms are going to take a tour of the hospital that they plan to deliver at. This is just to get a feel of the layout of the hospital, get a feel for what the staff is like, and they also go over frequently asked questions, so where things are, how things are going to happen, and especially if you're a first-time mom, you don't know any of those things. It's also a time to ask questions. So we're going to go over 35 questions that you should ask on your hospital and delivery tour. Okay, so let me preface this by saying I am not a doctor. This is not medical advice in any way. I am just sharing what I wish I would have asked as a first-time mom. Also, these aren't in order of importance. They are in order of your birth progression. So let's get started. So the first question that you should ask is, what is the hospital C-section rate? So I'm pretty sure most moms don't go into birth asking for a C-section. There might be a few, but most of us are trying to avoid that. So you want to ask the hospital what their C-section rate is. Some hospitals are going to have a higher rate than others, and you want to find out why. The second question you want to ask is, will I labor and deliver in the same room? Hospitals are going to differ. The hospital that I was at, I labored and delivered in the same room, and then shortly after I gave birth, I moved to the mother-baby unit, which was a much smaller room, and I did not know about that. So that is a good question to ask. Will you labor and deliver in the same room? Will you then be moved to a different room? Just ask so you know what to expect after you give birth. You also want to ask how many births they normally have going on at one time. If there's a big number, it may mean that you aren't getting as much attention as you should be. If you're delivering at a bigger hospital, there might be more people delivering at the same time, and this is just a good thing to know. And you may also want to ask, if all of their rooms are filled, what happens then? Another thing that you want to talk about is how many people are allowed in the labor and delivery room. For me, I was allowed as many people as I wanted up until the time that I started to push. So my dad was in and out, my father-in-law, my brother-in-law. But when I started pushing, they were only allowed 2 people and then my husband. So I had my mom, my mother-in-law, and my husband. You want to ask this. Some hospitals are going to be different, and I know with everything going on right now, those policies are different. They're only allowing 1 person or sometimes no people. But you just want to ask how many people are allowed. That way you can prepare ahead of time. Now these next questions are going to differ depending on what kind of birth you want to have, whether you want to have a medicated birth or an unmedicated birth, and that is all your choice. But if you're planning to have an unmedicated birth, you may want to ask if you are allowed to labor in the shower. This is a question that I did not ask, and I wish I would have, because once I got there, I was too nervous to ask, too frazzled to ask, and it would have been lovely to labor in the shower. So you may want to ask about that. Another question that you may want to ask is, are you allowed to labor in a birth tub? Does the hospital provide a birth tub? Do you need to provide a birth tub? Can you give birth in the tub? Different hospitals have different policies. My hospital allowed me to labor in the tub, but they would not allow me to give birth in the tub. So you need to find out what your hospital allows and if that goes along with what you are wanting for your birth. If not, you may need to find a different hospital in your area that allows you to do a water birth. Another question that you may want to ask is there a sleeping area in the room for my spouse? A lot of hospitals will have just a little chair or a couch, but you always want to make sure that there is somewhere for your spouse to get some sleep also. You may also want to ask if you are allowed to walk around during labor and if you will be continuously monitored. I know a lot of hospitals have wireless monitors. That's what I had when I was in labor, but my wireless monitor didn't work very well, so I had to stay in my room anyway. You may want to ask if you need to be continuously monitored, if you can go without the monitor, if you can walk. All of these things that go into your birth plan, you're going to want to ask your hospital if those are okay. Just like you're going to want to ask their policy on fetal monitoring, you're also going to want to ask their policy on IV. Do they automatically put an IV in upon arrival? Do they wait until you might actually need it? What is their policy and what do you want? I did not ask this, and I wish I would have, because as soon as I got there, they put an IV in me and it was super uncomfortable, so I wish it would have been something that I asked about, but at that point, it was a little too late and I was just done. Another question that you may want to ask is, will the hospital provide a birthing ball or a peanut ball, or do you need to bring your own? My hospital provided both of them, but some of them may not, so you may want to ask that, especially if you plan on using them during labor. You may also want to ask if you are allowed to bring an essential oil diffuser and if you are allowed to use those during delivery. I know different hospitals have different policies on this, and you may not even want to use essential oils during birth, but if it is something that you are wanting, you need to ask ahead of time, because they may not ask it, and if you get there and are expecting to use essential oils and you're already in labor, it could cause some stress. Also, you may want to ask if you are allowed to play music while you're in labor. I know a lot of people like to make special playlists and play them while they're in labor. Some hospitals allow that and some don't, so you need to know that beforehand. A big question that you may want to ask is, does your hospital have students or interns on their birthing floor? I did not think to ask this, and there was a student that came in to observe my birth, and it wasn't a big deal, but it was kind of frustrating at the time when I was in active labor. So you may want to ask us ahead of time and see if you can request to not have a student if that's what you want, or either way. But it's just nice to know what's going on ahead of time. Also ask if you can eat or drink during labor. Different hospitals are going to have different policies. Most of them aren't going to let you eat. They're only going to let you drink clear liquids or eat like Jello or popsicles or something like that. But it's always nice to know ahead of time. I wish I would have stopped on the way to the hospital and gotten a snack or a meal, but I didn't think about it because I couldn't eat for another 20 hours while I was in labor. So just a heads up, stop and get some food on the way to the hospital. But be sure to ask your hospital what their food and drink policy is while you're in labor. Okay, we are on question 18-ish. Can I wear my own gown during labor? I wore the hospital gowns during labor. I wish I would have asked if I could wear my own because it would have been a lot more comfortable, but I was too scared to ask. So don't be like me and ask whether you can wear your own gown during labor. If that's not something that you really care about, then don't bother asking. But if you do want to wear your own, be sure to ask ahead of time. They may have certain requirements about buttons and access and all different types of things, so be sure to ask. You also want to ask that in the event of a C-section, do they allow for a gentler C-section? So this just means that you get to watch the baby being born and some other different things that you can Google. It really differs on what your idea of a gentle C-section is. Some hospitals will do this and some won't. So I would ask beforehand what their policy on C-sections are, emergency C-sections, and all those different things. Okay, let's get to the questions about after baby is born. You want to ask if the hospital does delayed cord clamping. I know this is becoming more regular, but some hospitals still don't do it. And if this isn't an important thing to you, then don't worry about it. Can I do skin to skin with my baby as soon as they are born? Most moms just want to hold and snuggle that baby and get some breastfeeding in. But some hospitals want to take the baby and do tests and all this stuff right away. You need to ask the hospital what their policy on this is and whether you can request something different or not. You want to ask the hospital whether they provide pacifiers without parental consent. This isn't a big deal to some people, but to moms that are breastfeeding, it might be a big deal. We want to avoid nipple confusion, so if you don't want your baby to have a pacifier, you probably need to make it known on your birth plan, but also ask the hospital if this is ever an issue. You also want to ask if they provide formula if it is needed. Whether you're planning on breastfeeding or planning on formula feeding, this is a good thing to know. I planned on breastfeeding and that just didn't happen in the hospital. So we supplemented my daughter with formula, but thankfully our hospital provided it. You may want to ask what type of formula they provide, and if you want a specific formula for your baby, you may need to bring it. Speaking of breastfeeding, you may also want to ask if the hospital has a lactation consultant. Most of them do. My hospital did, but she was very busy, so to get her attention was very hard. I wish I would have hired an outside lactation consultant. Also, just a little tip, most hospital lactation consultants aren't that great. They're overworked, they have too much going on, they're just not that great. So I wish I would have hired an outside lactation consultant in the hospital. I did when I got home and she was amazing, but I wish I would have done it in the hospital. So that is something to look into. Next, what happens to my baby if they need to be transferred to the NICU? You need to know if your hospital has a NICU and to what extent can they care for your baby. My hospital had a small NICU, but if there was something seriously wrong with the baby, they would have had to transfer to a bigger hospital about 30 to 40 minutes away. This I already knew because my nephew was in the NICU in the same hospital, but this is good to ask. You want to know what's going on because if your baby is transferred to the NICU, there will be enough stress going on without you having to ask 50 million questions about how they can care for your baby. Okay, we skipped one of the breastfeeding questions, but you want to ask if your hospital has a breast pump that you can use while you're there. I did not even think about this. I didn't think I would need the pump in the hospital because I plan to exclusively breastfeed, but thankfully my hospital had pumps that you could use while you were there. So I used a Medela hospital grade pump while I was there, but you could also bring your pump from home. Either way works. You just want to know whether you need to bring yours or whether you can use one at the hospital. You also want to ask what all the hospital provides. Do they provide diapers? Do they provide postpartum supplies? You want to know so you can prepare ahead of time and what you need to pack in your hospital bag. My hospital provided pretty much everything I needed, but I didn't know that going in, so I very much overpacked. So don't be like me, ask what the hospital provides so that you can pack minimally. So like I said, after I delivered, I was moved to a different room. You want to ask your hospital how long after you deliver are you moved to a different room if you are moved, and how long a typical hospital stay is. I know if you have a C-section, it's a little bit longer, but for us, we stayed pretty much 24 hours after my daughter was born. Different hospitals are gonna have different policies, but it's nice to know what's going on. So after baby is born, you also want to know how many visitors you are allowed then, what are visiting hours, can kids visit, all those different questions. You may not even want visitors, but if you do, these are good questions to get answered so that people know ahead of time what to expect. Lastly, let's talk about a couple questions for prep work. So you may want to ask if you can fill out paperwork before you even come in. That way, once you come in when you're in labor, you don't have to worry about filling out paperwork. I was able to do all of mine ahead of time, fill out all my health insurance information, all those good things, so that when I came in, they took me straight up to labor and delivery. You also want to ask where you enter the hospital when you come to give birth. For us, we had to go through the emergency department, and then they would send us up to labor and delivery where we would be in triage, and then they would decide if they were going to admit us. But it's just nice to know where you need to go because we honestly had no clue. We had to call our doctor and ask. And the last question, which I could have included at the beginning when we were talking about labor, but you want to ask your hospital how long they let you labor before they start suggesting interventions, especially if you are wanting a natural birth. How long can you labor? How long can you go after your water has broke? All those different things. So for me, my water broke before my contractions even started. So my water broke at 8 a.m. I went into the hospital and I didn't have any contractions till probably 12 or 1. So my midwife was letting me know that if I went 12 hours after my water had broken and I still didn't have contractions, that then they would start using interventions, which I did not want. But it would have been nice to know that ahead of time just to prepare. So be sure to ask your hospital questions like those. Okay guys, so those are 35-ish questions that you should ask your hospital on your labor and delivery tour. Or you could even ask your midwife some of these. I know you might not want to go asking 50 questions on your hospital and delivery tour, but all of these questions are valid and they are good to know. Also, I have a blog post with all of these questions listed if you would like to go back over them. I will leave the link in the description box if that interests you. Okay guys, well that is all for today. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button, and I will see you guys next time. Bye! Especially if you plan on living on C-sections are emergency C-section, but a lot of moms want to do delayed cord requests made known, and this I already knew because my hospital. You want to ask your hospital how long after you try to make yourself feel better by taking me down. Once I fell, but now I'm strong, I'm ready for